Well, welcome back to another video in our educational series on reptiles. Brought to you again by myself, Mark Perpetua of Reptile Encounters, in conjunction with Hudson Valley Reptile and Rescue. Today's video, we want to talk to you about feeding pet snakes. There are a lot of do's, there are a few don'ts we want to go over, and I also want to talk to you about a couple of myths that still persist for some reason in the pet trade, why they might be out there, but why I believe they're myths, and try to debunk them today. But the first thing you'll notice right here is that we are going to actually do some feeding. Is I have a variety of prey items in front of me. Most of what people keep as pets in the pet trade today do perfectly fine on a diet of rodents. You'll notice all these rodents are pre-killed. We buy them sourced out from a commercial breeder for the pet trade. And we have a variety of sizes. Over here, we got a large rat, a small rat, a couple different sizes of mice. But yeah, they're all dead, but chosen as the appropriate size for the type of snake that we're going to be feeding today. So we'll talk about appropriate size, how to judge that, and why that's important. Also, going to the dead, they were, of course, frozen before we used them to keep them fresh. And they do need to be thawed out completely. All these mice are at least at room temperature. Some people will use warm water to thaw them out if they're in a hurry to do their feeding. I like to plan my feeding at least 24 hours ahead. I do like to do the feeding inside the cages, and I don't want to put a wet mouse on the bedding for various reasons that we'll talk about. And I don't know, have you ever tried wringing out a large rat when it's soaked in hot water? A little messy, so I like them to be dry. We also have some tools in front of here that we're going to be using. I do not like to feed by hand. Some people do, for two reasons. One, you don't want the snake to accidentally grab you, or two, you don't want your big bulky fingers and hands startling the snake. So various tools like hemostats, as they're technically called, a lot of people just call them feeding forceps. You can get them in a variety of lengths. You can get them with curved handles so you can reach into different parts of your cage easier. Or if you're feeding new hatchlings and newborn snakes, just a pair of tweezers, just a little bit of distance between the smell and the appearance of your hand, as you'll see as we go throughout. I included a snake cook too, because if you're dealing with a species that's large or an aggressive feeder, if it knows food is coming, you might want to use the hook to manipulate it. So that might be an important tool, especially with some of your larger boids or pythons. And then finally over here, you might have noticed a hairdryer. Our first specimen, I'm going to explain why we have a hairdryer as a snake feeding tool. All right, so our first feeding is going to be with a ball python. Some people like to call them royal pythons because of their scientific name, Python regius. But the ball python is one of the most commonly kept pet snakes. And we're going to demonstrate feeding this snake out on our display table just so we can get a really good shot. And also talk about a couple of myths quickly. One of the things that a lot of people are worried about with their pet reptiles, and for good reason, is overstressing them. And normally people would recommend not handling a snake before feeding because you don't want to upset the snake, make it nervous. And that's a good idea for someone who's got a busy life and is not able to handle their snakes often. My snakes are used to being out and among people frequently, not just because I like to handle them, but we do educational shows. Well, one of the things I wanted to point out while having it out is this snake has already picked up the smell of that tray of rodents that I set aside from when we first started. So being out of its cage does not seem to affect this snake one bit. But of course, me moving it to keep it on the table, she's lost the track of that smell, but she's picking it back up. So snakes, as we know, use their tongues to help them smell. They are transmitting scent from the air back to the Jacobson's organ in the roof of their mouth. And right now, she's picking up the smell of the rodents. Snakes are largely scent hunters. They pick up smells. Movement helps them zero in on their prey, but smell is the number one thing that puts them in the right direction or even identifies it as the proper prey species. So we had a small rat out for this snake, and I'm going to go ahead and grab it, and I'm sure she's going to grab it as soon as it goes in front of her face. Are you ready? So there we go, a constrictor. She grabbed the prey by her mouth, about 100 needle sharp teeth, only gave it one coil because this snake has never really dealt with struggling prey. Another myth to mention is that ball pythons require live food. Maybe 30 years ago when I first started in the hobby, ball pythons were largely wild caught imports, and a lot of them didn't make the adjustment not only to dead prey, but the scent of what we use from domesticated white rats compared to what they normally eat out in the wilds of Africa. But today's ball pythons are captive bred. They are raised on domesticated, raised rats and mice, the white rats and mice that you see here today. And they're really used to those smells from day one. So that's why this snake grabbed. Another reason that a ball python might want live prey is they have heat sensors in the front of their face. Not quite as sensitive as something like a pit viper, a rattlesnake, a copperhead, but they do pick up heat. And not just ball pythons, some of the bigger pythons I worked with, like Burmese pythons, also have them. And from time to time will be stubborn on a cold rat. This rat's been out for 24 hours. It's nice and warm. But every now and then, I'll get a stubborn python that just wants its food warm. That doesn't mean I have to right away resort to live prey. The trick that I have learned is just warming it up. Don't use a microwave. Bad things happen in the microwave, especially to small food items, especially if your wife finds out that you're cooking mice for your snakes. But a hairdryer. Hairdryer, just enough to warm up the fur, is enough to trigger that snake into zeroing in, not only on the smell, but now the warmth of warm-blooded prey, which is what many pythons will look like. If you're not keeping a ball python and you're working with most of the colubrids, snakes like corn snakes, rat snakes, and king snakes, which are even more popular as pets, they don't have the heat sensors, and I don't believe that the hair dryer is a required tool in that particular case. But I find it beneficial with some of my stubborn ball pythons. All right, so for our next snake we're going to feed, we have our normal corn snake. This is a harmless colubrid, and it is a snake that has already picked up the smell of rodents in the room from the thawing process, feeding the ball python earlier. This snake knows there's food in the room. So this is a perfect opportunity for us to debunk another myth that a lot of people have. And that myth is feed your snake in a separate box to keep it from being food aggressive in its cage. And the reason that is a myth is because your snake should only associate prey by smell, as we mentioned earlier. And if you are cleaning the cage and interacting with your animal often, that snake will not associate your hand and movement alone with food. Now, where this does become a problem is somebody who's busy at work, somebody who is not handling their reptile often. And if it's been months before you handled your snake and it's had 3 or 4 feedings, they might just get overly excited at the movement because they know food is coming. And that is why they sometimes seem food aggressive. But here's my demo. This is a snake I handle a lot. He's already looking for food. The tongue is flicking. I'm going to put my hand in his cage, and he sees the movement. He smells my hand, and it doesn't smell like rodent. That's another important do. Make sure your hands do not smell like the prey you offer your snake. Otherwise, they'll get confused and think you're food. So don't smell like a rodent, smell like a human. And if you're in that cage often, he will not think you're food. So with that done, now I'm going to grab the mouse. And again, we're using a frozen thawed mouse. Smell alone is all it should take. He's picked up the smell. And there it is. Now, because this snake has been in captivity all its life, it is a constrictor, but this snake knows that there's no reason to waste the energy, and it's always eating frozen thawed. And you saw it was a little bit more gentle, which is why some people might feed a corn snake by hand, but I just prefer the tongs. So the next snake that we want to feed is in the tank right in front of me. And this is going to be a good example of a newer, more newly acquired snake, and another reason why I think box feeding is a bad idea. Sometimes with newly acquired snakes, they're not as used to being moved and feeding at the same time as the first 2 snakes that we saw today. And one of the suggestions is to let your snakes acclimate to its new environment. And snakes are well known for being able to go long periods of time between meals. So it's not uncommon to let your newly acquired pet sit for about a week in its new environment before you offer it its first food. If you put the effort into that acclimation time, the last thing you want to do is disturb it, moving it to a box in an area where it's now new, it's now foreign, and it may not eat. But yeah, so this little guy in here is just what we call a neonate. That means newly born. It's not a hatchling because this species is not an egg layer. This was a live born snake called a northern water snake. And this was actually a true rescue. This snake was found during a 2-day snowstorm in February. Not outside, but in a neighborhood home in the basement. It's a really good chance that this snake's mother gave birth in a flower bed near the house, and then the snake found its way as a baby into the foundation instead of a normal hibernaculum. So anyway, I've already had this snake for a few months then, and this snake has taken to eating very well. And obviously we had to do some disturbing to expose. It was hiding under its big water bowl. The other thing to mention here as well is making sure you have the appropriate food for your species. Most pet keepers are going to end up with a corn snake, a rat snake, a king snake, maybe a milk snake or a gopher snake, or something like a ball python or a boa constrictor. And all of those do fine from day one on rodents of the appropriate size. If this was a corn snake, I'd want to give it a newborn 1-day-old pinky, something small enough, just a little bigger than its head, that it would be able to swallow. But more importantly, that pinky would have the appropriate smell for the right type of prey that a corn snake would eat. But being a water snake, they're not mouse eaters. Water snakes are not venomous, but they're also not constrictors. So they actually swallow their food while it's still alive. So they have to eat things that aren't going to be able to bite and fight back. So one of the biggest prey items for a water snake is fish. When they get bigger, they'll eat frogs. At this size, it might eat tadpoles as well. But right now, he's feeding on a diet of small minnows. And If I fish one out of this aquarium here, this is the only live item we're going to use. Another reason for using dead prey is not just because it makes my life easier. I didn't have to worry about that corn snake or that ball python getting scratched or bitten in the process of constricting. So here we have our little newborn water snake. He might act a little defensive, a little stressed by the presence of my hand, but once he picks up the smell of the fish, I hope he doesn't make a liar out of me. There we go. Again, a very gentle grab. He's learned in just the few months that I've had him how to accept food off of the tongs. Completely well acclimated to his environment. But as you notice, there's no constriction going on. There's no venom at work. And he is just going to slowly swallow that live minnow. Here we have a Colombian Boa Constrictor. It's going to be one of the largest snakes that anybody in New York State is going to be able to keep as a pet. And as a bigger snake, this one's nearly 7 feet long. It also comes with bigger teeth. So a little earlier, we had a snake hook out. This is one of the occasions where if you're working with a large snake and you are worried about food aggression, that a snake hook is all it takes to let the snake know that you're coming in to change a water bowl. You can even hook the top part of the body or the front part of the body in order to pick it up. And then once you get it moving and out of the cage, you'll find that your snake will know it's not feeding time. Again, if you're going to move a snake this big to a box to feed it, you then have to move it back to its cage. I keep emphasizing the no need to go to a box because I think with a big boa constrictor, it would put you in a more dangerous situation of having to handle it directly after feeding to get it back in its warm cage for proper digestion. Where in this case, we're going to feed it, we're going to put its heat lamps back on, and he can go ahead and take care of that digestion properly. The other thing to mention here is the appropriate size of the prey item. Obviously, a bigger snake is going to need bigger prey. Snakes can swallow things much larger than their own head. But do you need to do that in captivity? I like to grab something about 2 times the size of their head, almost as round as the thickest part of their body. But keep in mind that smaller prey items would need more frequent feeding. So here we have the large rat that we had earlier. Again, I'm going to use a pair of tongs just to make sure my hand's out of the way of those big boa teeth. But again, raised in captivity on frozen thawed, a powerful constrictor in the wild. It's just going to grab a hold of the face of this dead rat and then begin swallowing it once it knows that it is dead without needing to constrict. But again, the reason I like dead prey over live is the larger you get with prey items for big snakes, the greater the risk to the snake during constriction. All right, so for our final feeding for today, we're going to feed a young gopher snake. He's in his hide right now, so I'm going to gently remove that so that he can see the rodent when we put it in there. And I saved him for last because he's one of the newest snakes in the collection that I have right now that we're feeding today. And he's one of the ones that does need a little bit more time to acclimate. I don't know if the camera could pick it up, but right now he's shaking his tail. The other thing I wanted to point out is that as a young gopher snake, he's also a very small gopher snake. This is one of the larger snakes in the U.S. They can grow to nearly 7 feet long. So the other thing to mention with that is feeding schedules. Snakes are well known for going long periods of time without food. And I know of an anaconda at a zoo that went 2 years before it ate again and didn't look like it lost any weight. And while that's true for a big snake that is not growing quickly and probably had a very big meal, in captivity, if we're feeding them smaller items, like I said, about twice the size of their head, roughly the width of their body, that's an item that they're going to digest in probably a week. And that's okay for the big boa, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, even a month, because they're not growing quickly. But in a snake like this gopher snake, because it's young and still has room to grow, we're going to want to feed this snake at least once a week A hatchling might actually eat somewhere around once every 5 days. But like I said, with a little bit of stress, you might notice this snake doesn't like all the activity, and I'm not getting a good feeding response. And that could be either one, it's not very hungry, though I do believe it did because it just shed a couple of days ago, or it doesn't like all the activity. Here's another benefit of having a dead rodent. I can leave that rodent in the cage now and not have to worry about the rodent biting the snake. Even though snakes like gopher snakes are constrictors, they only use that when they're going to eat. So that's another thing that we should point out. Never leave a live rodent in a cage unattended. If the rodent turns on the snake will not know it should kill that item because it's not in the mood to eat it. And rodents can do a nasty job caged in with a snake that's not going to eat. But I can feel safe leaving that dead one in there. And if it doesn't eat it, like we said, 2-3 weeks at a time is not a danger. Don't stress out if your snake goes for a period of time where it doesn't eat. And if that happens, just keep watching our video series, and I'm sure we're going to add something on stubborn or problem feeding situations a little bit later. Okay, so in today's video, our discussion on feeding snakes was just to go over some of the basics and be extremely generalized. Of course, different species may have slightly different requirements that you want to be a little bit more specific on. So if you're in the market for a pet snake or already have one, make sure you do your research and look back. We're going to do some more videos, more species specific in the future. But the one last thing I thought we should mention before we close is how often you should feed your snake. That's probably the biggest question that I get when people get a new snake. And here we have the two most commonly kept species in the pet trade, the corn snake and the ball python, two examples that were fed earlier. It depends on, of course, a couple of different factors when you want to determine how often you should feed your snake. Number one is age. The age of the snake means the snake is going to be using a lot more energy to grow more quickly, just like any animal. But what is more quickly and how often? While a child might need to eat 3 times through the night, a newborn baby, a corn snake might eat every 5 to 7 days. And that is normal because, again, they're cold-blooded. Most of that energy is going to go directly to growing and not be needed to generate body heat. So having a 5-day span between meals is a completely normal and healthy thing. Same idea for the ball python. Maybe 5-7 days for a newly hatched snake, one you brought home from the pet store. That's a good feeding regimen. As they get older, their meals get bigger, their growth rate slows, you can start spacing out their meals. And snakes are known for going a really long period of time without food. Typically, however, a large mouse to a corn snake this size of around 4 to 4.5 feet, I would still probably try to continue once every 2 weeks. But on a big, heavy-bodied python, which might have a slower metabolism, this is an animal that typically goes about 1 month between meals. A small rat, about the size of the thickest part of its body, is something that will easily last it. And if your snake decides on one day that it's not hungry, don't panic. Even though this snake might regularly eat 3 to 4 weeks at a time, it could easily go 2, 3, maybe even 6 months in between meals. As long as you know your snake is healthy and you got the right temperatures, don't panic if it doesn't eat every time you want it to. In fact, making today's video, we had a gopher snake that I was for sure was going to be hungry. And for some reason, he didn't want to take. Maybe he just got shy because of the camera. But we didn't panic. We waited a day or two. And then he was ready to eat right away when he didn't have so much activity going on. So that's it for feeding snakes. Hopefully you enjoyed seeing the animals eat today. Hopefully you enjoyed or learned something from some of the information we gave you. And hopefully you keep coming back to see more of our videos in the future.